But we came up with a definition of truth, which was something is true if you can show where the source came from. So we came to retrieval-augmented generation, we came to sourcing. If you looked at like what people like Perplexity are doing, right, where you're putting sources in, we come to that, and we come to it from a definition of truth, right? Something's true if you can show where the source comes from. And two is whether a human chooses to believe that source. So that took us then into deep notions of human in the loop.
Today, I'm bringing you a conversation with Sean Williams, who's co-founder and CEO of AutogenAI. They've raised $60 million over 2 rounds. They're currently Series B, doing proposal writing for businesses. This was a really fun episode. We got deep into some of the philosophical questions with LLMs, why they're not intelligence, what truth means in the context of bid writing and LLMs more generally, but also, why we're at a kind of internet moment with AI, what the future might hold, as well as a bunch of really specific things around AutogenAI's growth and the ways that being tied to such a specific win or loss when it comes to the bids that they're helping with has been really helpful in, one, evaluating the effectiveness of their systems, but also of demonstrating ROI to their customers. So a lot of useful insights if you're building in this space and you want to learn how you can anchor to something that clearly demonstrates value to your customers. I love this conversation. I hope you do too. Thank you for taking time out of your day to watch or listen to The Chief AI Officer. Today, I'm really excited to bring you Sean Williams, who is the founder and CEO of AutogenAI. Sean, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Fantastic to be here, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting into everything you're doing at Autogen, your views on the market. You just made a move to New York as well, so you're not too far away from where I am. But, how's the move going, just as a starting point?
Fantastic. I'm working pretty long hours, so I've not had a huge opportunity to explore. And it's been a bit cold, but it's beautiful in the sunshine. I've got a fantastic view from the apartment I've just moved into. So yeah, I'm loving it, loving the food, loving the people. Yeah, having a great time here.
Nice. Well, long hours. Welcome to American entrepreneurship, Sean. I'm sure it was probably like that in the UK too, but it's even more grueling out here.
Yeah, it's, I like being busy.
That's good. That's good. Just to give our listeners a tiny bit of context, can you let them know what AutogenAI is, and then also what made you decide to tackle that particular problem after already having some experience in startups?
Yeah, so we use generative artificial intelligence, other artificial intelligence language techniques, and indeed lots of cave person NLP type techniques as well to help people write bids and proposals faster, more effectively, and more efficiently. So we help people win more work. Anyone who has to win work by writing, so, be that a proposal, be that a bid, be that a response to an RFP. So evidenced prose, anything where you have to write to specific criteria, where it's a competitive context where you have to write best and meet the scoring criteria best, then our software is built specifically to do that, using this, I would still call it magical power of computers to read and write, which is such a relatively recent emergent property. So you asked why this use case and how did I get into it? So I've had 3 careers. In my first career, I actually was a proposal writer. So I was a researcher and a proposal writer, then a proposal manager, a capture manager, then a proposal director, then a group corporate development director, and lots of other kind of things from there. But my first career, as I say, was actually in writing proposals. Then I had a second career where I founded a management and technology tech training company, which I founded in 2016 and sold in September 2020. And then I retired in September 2021, so a year after selling the company. And I retired for 3 weeks. And I got very bored in those 3 weeks. I found that I'm not a person in life who's very good at balance. I'm either too busy or too quiet, but I can't cope with being too quiet. I definitely can't cope with being too busy. And I was just really fortunate. So my best mate, Andy, phoned me up and he said, "Hey, Sean, I know you're sat on your sofa twiddling your thumbs. You might want to have a look at these things called large language models. We've built one. This company called OpenAI have built one which no one's ever heard of. They can do what you said computers would never be able to do. They can read and write." And Andy's a mathematician. I said, Andy, don't be silly. What do you know about it? Andy, by the way, is on DeepMind's protein folding team. So, it's the one that they got fired.
So he knows a thing or two.
They kind of know what they're talking about, but not when it comes to reading and writing. So, but as I was bored, I was sat on my sofa twiddling my thumbs. So I took a look and I was blown away. I mean, I was genuinely blown away. I couldn't believe what the tech could do. And as I was playing with it, and I do use the term play with large language models, so I got it to translate Paradise Lost into modern English, all these things which are now quite, I got it to do new PG Woodhouse one-liners using a technique which would become multi-prompt kind of like a technique, but at the time didn't have names because, prompting didn't really have a name at the time. And all the time I was playing with the large language models, I just kept thinking, if I had this when I was 22 writing proposals, this would have been game-changing. So I put a small team of people around me, about half my original team proposal writers. So we came with a deep understanding of the use case we were trying to solve. And the other half of the team were data scientists, machine learning engineers. So we brought deep understanding, as much as you could have a deep understanding at the time of this emerging tech, because it was so new, and a deep understanding of the problem that we were trying to solve, which was very, very amenable to large language models for all their strengths and weaknesses. And so we are unashamedly a kind of single focus business, which is how do we help our customers win more, where customers win by writing. So we're definitely not smarter than the folks at OpenAI or the folks at Google, but we are single-minded and we do what we do best. And it's that focus that gives us that edge.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there that I would love to dig into. First, the 3 weeks retired resonates with me because I haven't been retired, but I know a lot of people who have been through that boat and then find it impossible to sit still. And so it sounds like you also have a bit of, founder DNA inside of you screaming at you to do things. The other side is the play. I think when GPT came out and lit the world on fire, it's not like it was even particularly new technology, but I think it was that element of play that, that consumer facing, very easy to interact with these models interface that kind of lit everyone's imagination on fire. And so like the things you describe playing with it are exactly the kind of things that I think made people kind of double take and have a completely different view of what was possible. And to your last point, like you're not competing against OpenAI or, you're single-minded. That's where I think so much of the value is accruing right now in AI, right? Is like the ability to be very single-minded on the use case, to be very close to customers, to like really understand what the workflows are and how to add value to those workflows. So let's start there because, has that panned out for you? Like, is being close to the customer and being single-minded allowing you to scale much faster?
Yeah, it was. So my background isn't tech. My background's philosophy. So I approach the problems slightly differently. And I think by approaching the problems differently, it's given me a different level or at least perspective of insight. So don't get me wrong, when I started playing with large language models, I knew they were remarkable, but you don't have to play with them for very long to find their limitations.
Yeah.
So it was very clear to me that in the early days of excitement, which was these things are going to be intelligent in 6 months' time, it was very clear to me that that was nonsense. And it wasn't clear to me that that was nonsense from a technological perspective. It was clear to me it was nonsense from a philosophical perspective. But actually, a lot of the people building the models had no idea what intelligence was. And you still see that, actually. And again, this comes down to there's a lot of knowledge in the world nowadays. So it's very difficult to know things across a very broad... You can have a broad range of knowledge and be very thin, or you can be very deep and not have a broad range of knowledge. And so not surprisingly, given the nature of the expertise required to build the deep tech in this space, is utterly dominated by mathematicians and astrophysicists who are enormously bright, of course, in their areas and domains of specialism, but they haven't actually read a lot on what is intelligent. I once heard someone actually say to me, the problem with AGI and superintelligence is no one's actually really sat down and thought, what is intelligence? And of course, the answer is that human beings have been asking what is intelligence for 5,000 years. Just because you've never read any of them that were asking that doesn't mean that they weren't doing it. An enormous body of work on what is intelligence. And just because also that no definitive answers were kind of got to in that space, but there's been actually a massive amount of thinking done. Like there's so in the sort of philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, there's been a massive amount of work done. And by really understanding some of those areas. So the other thing I bring to this, one was a much more three-dimensional view of what intelligence was, and a clear view that large language models were nowhere near anything around a three-dimensional view of what any normal human being would consider to be intelligence. If one thing large language models have brought to the table, it's that being able to pass tests is an incredibly poor proxy for intelligence. Yeah, no, and it's really funny now to see people actually try and redefine intelligence based on now being able to pass these tests.
Yeah,
Clearly not. I mean, it's clearly the wrong way. It's clearly the wrong way around. The other thing was the philosophy of language, and particularly how words work differently in different contexts. And the really interesting philosopher here was Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein started his career believing, as still is kind of quite a majority view in language with people working in the deep tech, that language is primarily about conveying scientifically verifiable facts. And actually that's about, and again, this is just empirically verifiable, right? About 0.5% of linguistic usage is communicating scientifically verifiable facts. The vast majority of what humans are doing with language is something different. So the early Wittgenstein thought that everything was about communicating sort of atomic facts, but the later Wittgenstein, so he's his own biggest critic, he started then to think of language in terms of language games, which is language is deeply context dependent, that what a word means in one place means something completely different in another place. And what I think is really interesting when you look at a lot of the thinking which is now happening with large language models and about how large language models are being applied to real life tasks is that it is massively context dependent. And it's really, really interesting to see context, which was an insight, Wittgenstein had like kind of 80 years ago, philosophically now be such an important insight in terms of very practical applications of what we would call linguistic engineering. So turns out the rules of writing a proposal, which is what we do, are different to the rules of writing a love letter, are different to the rules of writing a children's story, are different to the rules of writing a poem. And again, knowing that those are incredibly different linguistic games allows you to then understand why something that might be brilliant at writing poetry might be terrible at writing rules to a board game, because they're fundamentally different tasks. And I think kind of, so to go back, it's very long-winded and kind of like,
I love it.
blue sky view of saying, so I got to, this was always going to be workflow dependent and heavily context dependent machines, because there is no general language engine. There is no general intelligence. There's a teleological notion of intelligence and language, which is about what you're trying to do with it, the language game that you're trying to play. In a love letter, I'm trying to impress my wife. In a proposal, I'm trying to get the government to award me the contract, not somebody else. And those are fundamentally different games.
I love that historical context and bringing it back to Wittgenstein and the idea of language games. I think it's very easy to get lost in the hype in the market right now, let alone true language intelligence. Some people think LLMs are like the path to AGI, as you said, and it's so clear from people that think very seriously on these topics that just dramatically or like just severely misunderstands what cognitive intelligence is, what cognition is in the human mind, what adaptation, learning, context, all of those things mean to becoming truly intelligent. And so it's nice to have someone just talk through that and then put that in the context of Wittgenstein, because what I also see within businesses is it's becoming very clear that the training of models, the forays into agentic AI, like all of this is meaningless without the context of the business, like what, getting their data in the right order, being very clear on how you even bring the institutional and like tacit knowledge that is in people's heads to bear on the use cases that you're trying to build with an enterprise. Because I think there's some people that just think you're going to dump it, you're going to dump your database into the LLM and then suddenly it's going to start replacing work functions. And that's just absolutely not what is playing out in the market. So I love that perspective that you brought to that. And I mean, in terms of what Autogen is doing specifically, right? How you're bringing that, like clearly you understand that value of context from a deeply philosophical level. How are you making that case to businesses that might not have that that context and that also are just trying to figure out what should we be doing with AI.
Yeah, so the wonderful thing about our use case, again, it's one of the things I always liked about being a proposal writer in the early days, is it's empirical and it's objective about whether you were good or not. So actually, at the end of the day, if I write a poem, maybe my poem's great, maybe my poem's terrible. It's kind of a huge subjectivity kind of piece to that. With proposals, you either win or lose. It isn't objective. I've either been awarded the contract or I haven't been awarded the contract. Now you might say, well, it wasn't just the proposal. I was best friends with the procuring officer. I was, I mean, I'm not, all those things actually are vitally kind of important. But there is an objective criterion. You won or you lost. It is binary. So that gives us then a very clear scientific basis for evaluating the quality and the effectiveness of our overall solution and then the individual linguistic transformations within that solution. So, every time we are doing a piece of linguistic, and by the way, I talk about linguistic engineering rather than something like prompting. Prompting is someone adding an extra adjective to 6 words sentence to put into ChatGPT to get a slightly different answer. And, kind of when I first started playing with large language models, that was fun to do. We are kind of like 50,000 hours of engineering kind of past that. And it actually plays into deep notions of tacit knowledge, of contextual reasoning. So how much can you stop a human having to write their and their organization's entire life story into a new prompt every time they want to do something useful, and instead take the relevant parts of context? By the way, relevancy is human-level intelligence, knowing whether something's relevant or not. My wife has a great phrase here that, humans' great gift is our ability to forget. When I'm writing something, if I want to write an email to my team, I'm not wondering, although it's in front of me, I'm not wondering what color my coffee cup is. I'm not wondering about the telephone going off. I'm just able to ignore all of that context and just pick the context that's relevant. Now, the reasoning powers of large language models, again, this is a meta approach where we see in agentic AI, a meta approach is quite good for this in terms of being able to work out the right context. But it's a sort of infinite regress thing here, right? On context of context of context. One of the things that having a specific domain allows you to do is to understand the rules of that domain, and so be able to automatically set up the various different contextual things that you would expect to see in that domain. So winning pros in the proposals world, in bids and proposals, there are a set then of contexts of rules which are broadly applicable across the whole range. So when we're evaluating, if we're evaluating a piece of linguistic engineering, which is we want to take a piece of text and then we want to add a case study to that text. So we're taking that text, we're vectorizing it, we're finding a case study which looks like it might be relevant to it. We're then determining whether that's a good case study or not. Criteria for whether it's a good case study: does it contain lots of statistics? Has it got a customer testimonial? Has it? So you can come up with a again, based on research and based sometimes on intuition, right? This is what a good case study would contain. You're then able to incorporate that case study. You're then able to evaluate, when we added the case study, did we lose meaning elsewhere? Did we add the case study, but suddenly it went from being a 500-word paragraph to a 5,000-word paragraph, and now it's not within word limit. Now, so there's all of these, and again, for any transformation, we've maybe got 60 criteria that we are objectively saying, did it do this? Did it do this? To what extent did it do this? Again, which amazing large language models, they can evaluate themselves against those 60 criteria, right? And then every time a new model's released, or every time we want to do, try a new method of linguistic engineering for a transformation that we're trying to do, we're able to evaluate it very quickly across empirical, kind of scientific criteria, which tell us, is this good, is this bad? And then ultimately, of course, we map all of that against, did these proposals go on to win or did they not go on to win? So that's what we're doing. That's why, you can type into ChatGPT, how do you manage stakeholders, right? That's ChatGPT will actually give you what still to my mind is relatively astonishing. It will give you a perfectly decent contextless answer. But of course, to answer that question well, to score 9 out of 10, not 4 out of 10 in a evaluation criteria, you need to do that really well. So you need to determine what well looks like. Now, have we made a really good job? As you can see, I've already had to spend 25 minutes explaining that. So are we really good at doing that in our marketing material and other bits? Less than I would hope so. Again, the proof for us is the proof in the pudding.
Yeah.
Like organizations that use us win more. And then they come back to us and they never want to swap out for something which is generic, which isn't evidence, which isn't compelling. Because in our language game, in proposals, winning is everything. If you come second, you don't get the contract to build the aircraft carrier. You don't get the contract to clean the streets. You don't get the contract to all of those things that actually for our customers are the things that are their lifeblood revenue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that gives you such a big advantage in terms of the constraints around the domain and that clear success metric, because it's not easy to get that. I know I've seen a lot of like outcome-based pricing forays right now in agentic AI where it like, as that happens and as the agent scales, the company then starts to redefine what success actually is because it's quite vague, right? And in bid writing, you do have that very binary thing. And so I can imagine, what you're doing sounds like essentially like retrieval augmented generation based on company documents and their context combined with a lot of learning and development that you've done on what makes a good proposal and like how to win those proposals. And so I can see why combining those two, again, within like this very constrained domain can be so valuable. And ultimately, not only is that binary win-loss a great thing to feed your own models with, but it's a very good thing to feed like your ROI case with the customer, right? It's very, very clear how you continue to build with them. Yeah.
Super easy. At the end, you're putting in 50 proposals a year, you're winning half of them, and each of them are worth $1 million. You're currently doing $25 million.
Yeah.
We're going to double your output. So you're going to put in 100 and we're going to raise your win rate to 60%. Right? Yeah. 20 million. Then it doesn't matter what you pay us for our software. It's in the weeds compared to how much value we've created.
Yeah, when the unit economics are that simple, it's like that's a great place to be when you're selling into large companies.
Right.
You touched on another thing there in terms of, just prompting GPT to tell you about stakeholders versus having enough context. Like, I think what is interesting in this market right now is these models give such convincing responses that anyone who is not an expert just assumes that they're correct. And most experts will see that and think that it's like not a great answer, right? Like, it's like, as you said, once you start, they're immediately astonishing. And then the more you play with them, the more deeply frustrating they are when you're starting to kind of like push against the limits and recognize what is not really intelligence. How do you kind of, I guess, in the way that you've built AutoGen, balance that, that human expertise that might help really craft a winning proposal with all of the kind of efficiency gains and kind of deep learning that you can apply based on what you're doing? Like, where's the balance there for you?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of things which are now completely commonplace, we were doing right from the start, again, based actually on those, particularly trying to solve those problems. So we did retrieval augmented generation before anybody else was doing it. Why? Because we always knew there was no route to truth from randomly picking tokens to follow other tokens. I've said this a few times, the astonishing thing to me about large language models is not that they ever hallucinate, it's that they ever tell the truth. That is astonishing to me. That you can randomly pick tokens to follow other tokens. I understand why that would be grammatical. I understand why it's astonishing that it can create true sentences more often than not. Right, it is genuinely astonishing to me how it can pull out meaning. This sort of emergent property is kind of incredible. But that it sometimes or often hallucinates is not incredible to me at all. As soon as you scratch beneath the surface and you understand what they're actually doing, of course, it's not a mystery at all why they make things up. One of the ways I used to illustrate this a lot, and again, like people are starting to put stuff in their systems to stop you doing this, but it's all it's not the underlying large language models like which are doing this, it's the pre and post processing that that companies are doing. But I used to ask large language models, or large language, I still do, how does the Darjeeling tea harvest affect the speed of light? And you get like large language models write a beautiful essay, like thousands of words, like incredibly compelling stuff. I mean, it's just nonsense, but it's incredibly compelling nonsense. You really go, that sounds, there was a hoax, an American mathematician, Sakal, who played I don't know if you know the hoax he played. He wrote a paper called Towards a Theory of Quantum Hermeneutics, which was basically, was sort of a Mickey take on sort of postmodern philosophers and the sort of nonsense they would speak. So he wrote a paper, supposedly a physics paper. It was just nonsense, it was just a big joke. And of course, anyone who understood physics at any level, or indeed actually just the scientific method and what's nonsense, why isn't nonsense, could see it was nonsense, but he got it published.
Yeah.
And so it caused quite a scandal at the time. And of course, if I think one of the things large language models are really showing us is your ability to just churn out compelling sounding nonsense, like using these things. That is where I don't see a danger from super intelligence, because I don't think we're anywhere close. I do see a danger from misinformation and the ability to, very carefully target misinformation campaigns and really an assault on how most of us get our truth in terms of consensus and believing experts. But then I would go to, and I remember saying to a chief researcher at the time, James Huckle, really early on, we were talking about this problem and saying, well, of course, in proposals, what people are saying has to be true. They have to actually deliver it. If they give this proposal to a customer, their customer's going to expect them to back it up. If they say, we've done this in the past, they need to have actually done it in the past. Truth is incredibly important in this domain. So no problem, sure. By the way, we used to call that the Boris Johnson problem. Now, fortunately, now I live in America, so politicians always tell the truth here. At the UK, unfortunately, we had a problem that sometimes our politicians lied. Boris Johnson had a particular reputation for not telling the truth, or at least exaggerating. And, so we used to call it the Boris Johnson problem because, again, no one was calling it hallucination. It was before it was called that. And James, my researcher, said to me, no problem, Sean. We can solve the Boris Johnson problem. Can you just give me a quick 2-sentence definition of truth? Okay. Quick 2-sentence definition of truth. And so actually, of course, you can't give a robust 2-sentence definition of truth. Again, it's one of those things which has not been decided and is still argued about and has been for thousands of years. But we came up with a definition of truth, which was something is true if you can show where the source came from. So we came to retrieval-augmented generation, we came to sourcing. If you looked at what people like Perplexity are doing, right, we're putting sources in, we'd come to that, and we'd come to it from a definition of truth, right? Something's true if you can show where the source comes from. And 2 is whether a human chooses to believe that source. So that took us then into deep notions of human in the loop. So again, we came to human in the loop, we came to sourcing, we came to retrieval-augmented generation through trying to solve real business problems and then again, other people, of course, came to the same sort of answers through similar routes or through, kind of similar lines of reasoning. So now, look, don't get me wrong. You can show the source of something and a human chooses to believe that source. From a blue sky view is a terrible definition of truth, but it's a good enough definition of truth within the language game that we play of proposal writing, because it's as good, if not better, than anyone was doing previously, right? At least we've got sourcing, we can show you where it's come from, and you can see which human has chosen to then believe that piece. So actually it gives you better evidencing for your ultimate customer than you would have had with humans doing it without artificial intelligence.
Yeah, and it's exactly the kind of problem that got you off the couch, retired as a philosopher to get back into business, right? Because those are the exciting problems to be dealing with.
I was a very bad philosophy student, or practical. I love the fact that something which was useless for 20 years turns out to be quite a good way of thinking about. As I say, I never would have thought language would have been progressed as far as it has in technology. I once I'd seen large language models, I knew I had to work with them. They're just so exciting. And I often talk to people about their limitations and often say they're remarkably stupid, and I say they're nowhere near human level intelligence, and all of those things are 100% true. But they are remarkable, and they are going to change everything. It's, just because they're not human level intelligence doesn't mean there's not tons of stuff they can do, and stuff they can do so many multitudes of speed improvements faster than us, kind of, and by faster that can often lead to better. I don't need to say this to you, Ben.
No, I know, but it's funny because I have that reflection a lot when I'm thinking about the current market, where there's so much hype and there's so much, because it is remarkable like what you can achieve with the models, but at the same time, I think the people that spend too much time hyping it and not enough time pointing out the limitations actually kind of shoot themselves in the foot sometimes, because they raise the expectations so high. And inevitably, it doesn't reach that level of expectation. And so you're almost, in terms of going to market and growing your customer base, I don't think that's helpful because, you really do want to go in with very well managed expectations. And I also think people just, it's like the computer, it's like many other technologies, right? People don't understand how they work and then they fundamentally misunderstand what's actually going on. But those are really important things to think about, especially with this type of tool where it's, people are starting to offload their critical thought to it and really not think about like the outputs that they're getting from these models and just immediately inputting them into something else or creating chains of reasoning that are going to blow up in their faces because the accuracy is not quite there. And so I just think it is like a really interesting question to think about, like, what does this actually mean? Like, I think I fall on the side of cautious optimism, like I always do with technology, where I see the immense possibility, but then I also see, as you say, like so many horrible misinformation. What happens to your notion of truth, even when 70% of the content generated on the internet is from LLMs
yes, I should say. So I'm most excited because, So truth, just because you can show the source, as I say, is a terrible real.
Yeah.
Look, we're debating truth is beyond the sort of like reading
absolutely
some sort of correspondence theory of truth, that something is linguistic utterance is true because it corresponds to a state of affairs in the real world. Some sort of sophisticated notion of correspondence truth is definitely right. So I'm really excited about how you start to connect up large language models, AI systems to robotics, because what you're really missing is the feedback reality gives you. Like, how does the Darjeeling tea harvest affect the speed of light? You can write a beautiful essay on that. You can write 20,000 words. You can do it super fast using large language models. But the second you actually do an experiment, you can measure the speed of light and you'll find it is not affected by the Darjeeling tea harvest. But you have to do the experiment, right? It's the correspondence with reality that tells you whether it's true or not in actuality, right?
Yeah. I guess given all that, right? Like obviously you have grown very quickly at AutogenAI. I'm going to shift a little bit more just towards like the business side of things, right? Like you're dealing with truth for them, right? You're trying to help them win all these bids, right? They're probably also concerned about security if they're dumping all of their data into your system to help write bids faster. And there's like, procurement is frustrating in this market. How are you approaching that, and how have you kind of addressed some of the fears for customers that you're working with?
Yeah, great question. We always knew, I come from a corporate background. As I say, half my early team of proposal writers from corporates. So we understood that it wasn't going to be good enough to make a brilliant artificial intelligence tool. That artificial intelligence tool was then going to have to pass corporate security requirements. So we were never sort of a couple of guys from Y Combinator in a basement who didn't really understand corporates, who wanted to disrupt that and thought it was all stupid. And then why would they have these stupid rules? We're going to do it our way. We would say, well, they might be stupid rules. It doesn't matter. They're our customers' rules, and so we have to meet them. So right from the start, we made sure we got the certifications. We're the only people with like FedRAMP kind of equivalent security levels in the US, which allows us to be deployed in the most secure of contexts. So we've got defense customers across the world. People who are operating in very, very sensitive areas, and the large language models are used by the US intelligence services. They're used by kind of very powerful technology. The technology itself is not insecure. It has to be deployed in a secure way. So we have on-prem deployment options where that's most appropriate for people. Where we are doing sort of cloud-based single tenant or multi-tenant, again, depending on different security requirements, eyes-off agreements with all the large language model providers we use, where we are using external providers. So, it's none of the security concerns are showstoppers, but you do have to put significant, and we have put significant financial and human investment in to make sure you meet those criteria. And because I say commercially, we always came from a position of we're going to have to do this. And then, the first conversation we have with the customer almost before, because people are used to dealing with their IT security teams in their business. Always, I'm not even going to watch the demo of your product. Is it secure? Because if the IT guys say I can't have, I don't think it's the best thing in the world. But if the IT people say I can't have it, then I'm not going to be able to get it through. So that's sort of, it's kind of foundational for us. It's bedrock. It's a hygiene factor. It's a non-negotiable.
Yeah, I think that's it, right? It's not a compelling feature. It's just like it's table stakes and it will kill your deal if it doesn't exist. So you have to
That's
go
right.
there. Yeah. And are there certain things, in this space, are you seeing, is it often like the bid writer themselves within the company that is kind of your target persona business user? Are you finding it easy to sell into the business user? Do you have to do like more of a top-down sale? What does kind of your go-to-market look like, and what are some of the challenges that you're having and some of the successes?
Yeah, great. So we talk about doing four things at AutogenAI: build the product, sell the product, delight users, and demonstrate value. So build product, build best proposal writing software in the world. Sell the product. There's no point having the best proposal writer in the world unless people are using it. And delight users. So we want to make software that people adore using. And one of the things I really love is that proposal writers, proposal managers adore using our software. It's like it's such a tactile experience. Like writers, like a lot of, I think the history of tools is, if you look like the synthesizer, musicians might have gone, oh, it's a synthesizer, it's the beginning of the end, it's absolutely awful. But actually, most musicians were like, this is really cool. Right?
Yeah.
This isn't going to replace my trumpet. It isn't going to replace my guitar, but it's something I can play with. It's something which is interesting. It's something I can take my art to a new level and do, kind of experiments with. And good writers are like that with large language models once they're introduced to them properly. So we want to make an interface, we want to make it beautiful. So when we demo our software to proposal writers, they love it and they get it immediately. When we demo it to capture managers, to proposal directors, they get instantly, wow, this is going to save me so much time. It's going to make my life easier. I'm going to have more time to do the writing stuff that I enjoy. Generally, writers don't enjoy the first drafting process. That's true of proposal writers as it is of fiction writers, as it like that initial birthing of ideas onto paper is very cognitively hard, right? Kind of there's a reason people talk about writer's block and all of those sorts of good things that writers talk about. But then we realized we couldn't just have delight users. So build product, sell the product, delight users. We need to have demonstrate value, because even if all the users loved using our software, if the finance director isn't seeing more work one, and if they're not seeing the direct link between paying for our software and more work one, then they're not going to renew after a year. So when we're doing the sell, sometimes we'll be selling in to get to the question you asked me, sorry, in a very long-winded way. Again, I do apologize. It might be the theme of this chat. So we will either go in at finance director, corporate development director, growth director level, in which case that sell is, look, here's how much time we're going to save you. Here's how much more you're going to win. And generally then we'll go top down and they'll introduce us to some of their writers, and then almost the writers will sign it off. Yeah, what they were saying about the productivity gains are true. Or we'll start off, maybe one of our BDRs has contacted someone on LinkedIn, or a cold call has got through to proposal writer. We show the writers, we show the people who are actually doing the work. They're like, we must have this software, but it's not for me to make the decision. You see, to my boss. And then a lot of the time for them, that will be helping them make the business case.
Yeah.
Kind of so, hey, here's what to say to your boss about why they should buy this software for you. And that can't just be you get to work a bit less hard, obviously. That's not going to be a good business case up the chain, right? And then everywhere in between. Like it's a corporate sell. So as you know, and no doubt, sort of lots and lots of guests have said, corporates are not individuals. Corporates, tens, scores, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of individuals. So you don't get one person just going, we're going to do this, let's do it. You have to persuade multiple different stakeholders. And of course, so generally corporate development directors, growth directors, key stakeholders, proposal center managers, proposal writers are key stakeholders. And of course, the head of security, head of IT is a key stakeholder as well, for the reasons we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I think it helps a lot to shepherd that entire buying committee over the line when you have champions that are so excited about the product, right? So getting to the core of your four principles there, like if you can delight people with the product, that also goes a long way. If you can then deliver the value, I think do you feel like it's different than selling traditional software, like what you're selling today in terms of AI?
I think it's changed a little bit. So I should be honest, I don't have a background in selling traditional software, so I've got no idea what it's like to sell.
Fair enough.
I can't talk.
Good context.
I can only talk to what it's like to sell this. I think, in the early days, it was, hey, we've got a Gen AI budget line. Let's try some stuff out, because we've heard this Gen AI thing's a thing. And then, quite a lot of the time, particularly here in the United States, we were and are competing against people who have software that is part of proposals, but does something completely different to us. So, this is answer database. Well, answer database is kind of like, as far as I'm concerned, mid-1980s technology. But, and they should generate, why are you using this for generative? But people have got, this is how it works. Like it's really interesting, right? When people started using ChatGPT, and indeed most large language model usage is still, people are still using it as a search engine.
Yeah.
Like the search engine is actually a reasonably terrible use for large language models. Like people just so used to Google. I used to a box where I type stuff in. So they're asking, like a lot of the time, we're still using large language models to answer factual questions. What's the capital of France? I wouldn't ask ChatGPT what the capital of France is.
Yeah.
I'll ask Google what the capital of France is. I'd ask ChatGPT, let's role play. You're a French waiter and I'm practicing my French, like to order a coffee. I mean, that's a good use of ChatGPT, right? Not what's the capital of France, factual questions. So actually quite a lot of what's being done in large language models has been for this early use case of make them more factual and make them more like a search engine. Whereas quite a lot of the interesting use case for large language models, as I think we'll discover over the next years and decades, actually is in not looking up facts, which a search engine is much better at, but is in kind of creatively sparring with. And I don't know exactly what that answer looks like. I keep challenging our team with it. Someone's going to get it really right, and they're going to be the biggest company in the world. And then someone's going to get it really right, and I'm going to be, that's what I meant. That's what it looked like. Hopefully it'll be us.
Yeah. I mean, I do find that that's where the most, for me personally, where the interactions are the most interesting is really like when I'm using it as a sparring partner for thought, or like asking it to role play as three different people evaluating marketing content as these different buyer personas. Like there's just so many really interesting ways that you can leverage what it's good at. And you're right, a lot of people do over index on using it as an answer engine, right? Like the Perplexity use case, and that is not a great way of dealing with it.
Don't get me wrong, Perplexity are
no, they're amazing as well. I didn't mean to.
I just think one of the first things I did, so I had a really early access to, like OpenAI had turned off, is when people were, in the good old days where people were worried this stuff might be a bit dangerous. So OpenAI had turned off the playground, and it was really hard to get access to like any kind of sophisticated post-GPT-2 type models, but I managed to get access to it. And one of the things I was using it for was as a running coach. So I'd get up in the morning and I'd be like, I don't want to go running. Kind of like, hey, come on, Sean, you'll feel good afterwards. And it was, again, like, kind of, I was, again, kind of astonished by, I know this is just randomly picking syllables, and I know, but actually, do you know what? Empirically, I am running more often because I'm doing this every morning, and it's kind of working as a psychological motivator, even though I know it's not human, I know it's not real, but it is clearly having this cognitive effect on me. And I feel like I say this quite a lot as well. I feel like we're like the internet in 1996. You kind of like, it's perfectly possible to look at the internet in 1996 and go, oh yeah, it's pretty cool. I mean, like, it's not going to do anything, but like, that kind of, or you could be a travel agent in 1996 and say, this is good, but it ain't going to change my business. My business is about relationships with the people who walk through my door, my customers. It's about my relationships with airlines. It's about my relationships with hotels. And the internet is never going to change that. Just 10 years later, in 2006, that would have been an intellectually impossible position to hold. And indeed, if you'd held that position for any length of time over those 10 years, you'd be bust if you were a travel agent, right? It just changed everything. And that's where we are. Like, but in 1996, you probably wouldn't have got, one of the most popular websites in the world is going to be a place you can spread fascist conspiracy theories about Europeans in 200 characters or less. Kind of, it's, it would be, we insult one another in 200 characters or less. I think it was Steve Jobs, wasn't it? He says you can only join the dots backwards. There'd be so much stuff where people are going, that's so obvious in 10 years' time that would be a thing, that would come out. But it's not there yet. And those companies, the Facebooks, the Amazons, the Netflix, the Googles, those companies which were, built in that kind of primordial soup of kind of the mid-90s internet, they are being built now in generative AI, and there'll be like half a dozen which just take over the world in this space kind of over the next decade. And that's why I wanted to work in it, because it's just kind of so, I was a bit too young to do the internet kind of.
Yeah.
It's, it's just like not the right time. Whereas here, I'm like, yeah, this is a cool time to be in this technology.
It really is. Yeah.
It doesn't come along that often, right? Maybe every few decades that you get a world-changing kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think some of the most interesting conversations going on in this space right now are pushing that thinking to its limits, right? And thinking about what does it mean when there are agents that are working in the ways that we want them to work, that are interacting with other agents doing things, right? Like how radically does that transform the buying process, right? Like if your bid system has helped a human write the perfect bid, and then there's an agent on the other side of that evaluating the bid and like surfacing that to a human, right? Like we get into situations where we have to rethink also some of the structures of the internet and what it means to like interact, and like how these agents will interact. Are there surfaces that they're tapping into, like metadata on sites that they're like using to get more information in a structured way? There's a lot of really unanswered questions of what that means, but I think the people that are thinking seriously about what an agentic and what a generative future looks like are asking those types of questions. And so it's very, very interesting.
The really big thing I would say, and it's one thing that humans are, I will use the word uniquely, advisedly here, but I will use are uniquely good at, is when will the future not look like the past?
Yeah.
And that is particularly true in dynamic systems, and particularly kind of dynamic arms race type situations. So in marketing, what works in marketing really, really well stops working in marketing in 6 months' time, because then everybody's doing it. It just stops working. And often, if the underlying causal mechanisms don't change, then data is a very good guide to the future from the past. But if the underlying causal mechanisms change, then data might be a terrible guide to the future from the past. And given that all AI systems work on data and work on the principle that the future will look like the past, in dynamic systems, it's possible that the underlying mechanisms change, the future won't look like the past. Now, that will only be in specific domains and specific areas, but I don't see anything at the moment that is allowing that sort of human level insight and that human level understanding actually of causal reasoning. Like large language models just don't do causal reasoning very well, whereas more traditional computer systems did. Like I think that I think again is a really interesting. If I was in the deep tech, which I'm not, I don't have the intelligence or the patience for it. I'm in the commercialization, right, and ashamedly in the commercialization of the technology. I love seeing the deep tech and then thinking, what can I do with it? Right, that's the interesting bit. But if I were in the deep tech, that would be the bit I would be. That's where, like, as I say, robotics in terms of how do you link this stuff with the real world, and then causal reasoning, how do you start to think about this in a non kind of stochastic type way. That's
exactly what my previous company, Elemental Cognition, did exactly that, right? Neurosymbolic AI, like how do you combine formal causal reasoning systems with large language models that provide access? And it is like a really, really fascinating space. Sean, I could honestly talk about the philosophy and the business of AI with you probably for another 5 hours.
Well, I'd love to hear about that business. Yeah.
But that's all we have time for today. Let's go to like a really quick lightning round, because I'm very interested to hear your response. What's the AI tool that you personally use the most every day?
AutogenAI.
Yeah. And what's your go-to resource? Do you have one specific resource that you love for staying up to date on this industry?
My research team. Sorry.
Yeah, that's it.
On our Slack channel, people go, hey, look at this. This is cool. Read this. Yeah.
Yeah. And what's a phrase or idea that you recently heard that has really stuck with you?
When a measure becomes a metric, it ceases to be a good measure.
Love that. I will leave that hanging there for the end of the episode. Sean, I've really enjoyed this. If people who listen to the show want to follow your work, where should they go?
So AutogenAI's website, autogenai.com.
All right. Well, yeah, you heard him. That was Sean Williams, founder and CEO at AutogenAI. Sean, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure, man. Great to talk. Take care now.